The year 1945 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the world's pursuit of justice. After 6 years of global conflict and the most devastating war in human history, the Allied powers were determined to ensure that the architects of the Nazi regime would not escape justice for their heinous crimes. The Nuremberg Trials were set to bring accountability to the leaders of Nazi Germany, and for the first time in history, the world would witness the prosecution of individuals for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. The city of Nuremberg, a place once synonymous with Nazi rallies and propaganda, was now the site of a new kind of reckoning. It was here, in the aftermath of a war that left Europe in ruins, that the Allies decided to hold the top Nazi officials responsible for their actions. The trial would not just be about punishing the guilty, would also be a statement that no one, regardless of their rank or power, was beyond the reach of justice. The accused, 24 of the most notorious leaders of the Third Reich, sat in the dock of the courtroom. These were men who had once controlled vast swaths of Europe, who had overseen the death of millions, and who had worked to shape the world according to a twisted, racist ideology. Some of the men in the dock, like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, had been close allies of Hitler himself. Others, such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, had been instrumental in the Nazi war machine, serving in key government roles. The charges against them were as grave as they were numerous: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. The Nuremberg trials were unlike any previous legal proceeding. This was not just a court case, it was an international event, watched by people across the world. The stakes were high. The eyes of the world were fixed on the courtroom, and the outcome would have global repercussions. These trials were not just about bringing Nazi leaders to justice. They were about establishing a global precedent for holding individuals accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The charges presented were not merely theoretical. They were grounded in cold, hard evidence. The atrocities committed by the Nazis were undeniable. The court was presented with massive amounts of evidence: photographs, documents, and testimonies from survivors. The horror of what had happened in the concentration camps, the extermination of millions of Jews, the systematic murder of disabled individuals, and the vast network of forced labor camps were all laid bare in front of the tribunal. Crimes were not the work of a few isolated individuals. They were part of a deliberate, systematic campaign orchestrated by the Nazi regime. One of the most powerful aspects of the trials was the testimonies from survivors. Those who had lived through the horrors of the Holocaust, the concentration camps, and the mass executions came forward to give their accounts. Their stories were harrowing, detailing the unimaginable cruelty they had endured. Some had lost entire families, while others had witnessed the systematic killing of thousands. These testimonies were crucial in building the case against the Nazi leaders. The defense put forward by the accused was equally shocking. Many of the defendants tried to distance themselves from the crimes, claiming they were simply following orders. Göring, for example, insisted that he had been acting in the service of the Führer, while others claimed that they were too far removed from the actual killing to be held responsible. But the tribunal, led by Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, rejected these arguments. The principle that individuals could be held accountable for crimes they committed, regardless of the orders they were given, was firmly established. It was a critical moment in the evolution of international law. As the days wore on, the sheer scale of the crimes committed by the Nazis became more and more apparent. The accused were not just perpetrators of isolated acts of violence. They were the leaders of a regime that had systematically wiped out entire populations, destroyed entire cultures, and plunged the world into a war that killed tens of millions of people. The Nuremberg trials were not just about punishing individual wrongdoers. They were about shining a light on the darkest chapters of human history and ensuring that such atrocities would never happen again. The trial was not without its challenges. There were disagreements among the Allies about how best to proceed. Some wanted to conduct summary executions without trials, while others advocated for a more measured approach. In the end, the tribunal decided that justice should be served through due process, and each of the accused would have their day in court. The trial was a test of the rule of law, showing that even the most powerful men in the world could not escape the consequences of their actions. The Nuremberg Trials were also a symbol of the international community's commitment to justice. They represented a turning point in how the world would address war crimes and crimes against humanity. The legal principles established during the trials would serve as the foundation for future international tribunals, such as those for the Rwandan genocide and the Bosnian War. They laid the groundwork for the International Criminal Court, which would go on to prosecute individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the 21st century. But despite the significance of the trials, many questions remained unanswered. Could any punishment truly bring justice to the millions of victims of the Holocaust? Would the trial serve as a deterrent to future atrocities? And, perhaps most importantly, could the world ever truly heal from the wounds inflicted by the Nazi regime? The Nuremberg Trials were an important step, but they could never undo the devastation caused by the war or the lives that had been destroyed. As the trial proceeded, the world held its breath. The question of whether justice would be served out, whether the Nazi leaders would face the consequences of their actions, remained uncertain. The fate of these men would shape history, and the world's commitment to justice would be tested in ways it had never been before. The long-awaited day of reckoning arrived at the Nuremberg Trials. The courtroom, once filled with high-ranking Nazi officials, now reverberated with the weight of justice. The Allied judges had listened to the shocking testimonies, sifted through the staggering evidence, and now they were ready to deliver their verdicts. The question remained: who would pay the ultimate price for the horrors that had been inflicted upon the world? One by one, the defendants stood before the tribunal. The charges were read, and the judgment was passed. Hermann Göring, who had once been the epitome of Nazi power, was sentenced to death by hanging. But his fate would take a different turn. In a final act of defiance, he committed suicide in his prison cell the night before his execution, an act that, in some twisted way, preserved his pride even in death. For many, his suicide symbolized his unwillingness to face the consequences of his actions. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, who had played a pivotal role in orchestrating the alliances that led to the war, was another to face the noose. His cold demeanor throughout the trial did little to earn him any sympathy, and his execution was a stark reminder of the global rejection of Nazi ideology. Along with him, several other high-ranking officials, including Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, were sentenced to death. Not all were condemned to die. Albert Speer, the Nazi Minister of Armaments, was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but was spared the death sentence. Instead, he received a 20-year prison sentence. Speer, who had expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged his role in the Nazi war machine, became one of the few to show any semblance of repentance. For others, like Rudolf Hess, the verdict was less clear. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, not for lack of guilt, but due to his strange actions and the perception that he had been acting alone in his peace efforts. Hess spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison. Dying in suspicious circumstances in 1987, his fate forever shrouded in mystery. But the trials didn't end with the main figures. The Nuremberg Trials set the stage for further investigations into Nazi war crimes, leading to the conviction of hundreds of lesser-known figures, bureaucrats, and military officers. The scope of justice continued to expand in the years that followed, sending a clear message to future generations. The world would no longer tolerate impunity for crimes of such magnitude. While the Nuremberg Trials brought a measure of justice, they also raised profound questions about accountability, morality, and the limits of international law. Could the trials ever truly atone for the millions of lives lost? And what would become of a world that had witnessed such evil? These questions lingered long after the last sentence was read, as the world grappled with the aftermath of war and the dark legacy of Nazi Germany. The Nuremberg Trials not only marked the end of an era, but also laid the foundation for international law as we know it today. The principles established in Nuremberg, accountability for crimes against humanity. War crimes and genocide have influenced legal systems around the world. The trials represented a bold step in the fight for justice. But they also served as a sobering reminder that the fight for human rights and dignity is never truly over.